Welcome to section 2, camera basics. In here we want to take care of a few basic things and a few important things as well before we get started on the nitty-gritty of this class. And so I want to talk about a few basic things on the camera that, some people know about, some people are not quite as familiar with: sensor size, what are the primary controls we're going to be using. We're going to have an important discussion about the file format because that might be more important on this camera than any other that I've dealt with. And then, well, Fuji does things a little differently, so we need to talk about image style in here as well. Let's dig into it. All right, first up, I always like to say, well, this type of camera, but what type of camera is this? Because it falls within a lot of different categories, and cameras have a lot of different ways of being categorized. And so if I kind of think of all the different options on here, well, we know it's a digital camera and it's not a film camera. It's got a 44 by 33 roughly. I know it's not exact, but it's pretty close to that. And that generally falls in the world of medium format. Overall, it's a pretty compact camera. I don't like to call it a point and shoot. I think that's demeaning to this camera. I just think this camera has so much good manual capability. Point and shoots you usually think of being automatic, but technically it's a point and shoot camera of some regard. Lens-wise, it is a fixed lens. It is also a prime lens, so it could be considered a fixed prime lens on there as well. It uses an electronic viewfinder. It is technically mirrorless, as I said before. It's not quite a rangefinder, but it is a rangefinder style, which is kind of in the name of the camera and what Fujifilm calls it. So let me talk just for a moment about rangefinder cameras. And so this camera has the viewfinder in the upper left corner, and that is kind of how a rangefinder camera works. So the traditional rangefinder cameras usually come from Leica. There are other manufacturers, but they're the most well-known name brand on that. And they have a viewing window and they have a rangefinder window. And so you look through the viewfinder on the upper left corner, and it's a very boxy camera with a flat top to it, which is what this camera has, which is part of that rangefinder style that it has. Now, with a manual focusing rangefinder like the Leica M series, you're going to have an image frame, and you can see outside that frame, and you can actually do that with the Fuji GFX100RF. And so that's part of that rangefinder style, is you can do some of that in this camera. Now, what Leica does is they have a manual focus system where there's an overlapping patch in the middle. And when the images align, you are properly focused, and you have to do this manually with the lens. And that is something that the Fuji camera does not do at all. And so it is not a rangefinder camera, but there are rangefinder type features that you find on the camera, and it does look like one as well. And so that's what they mean by rangefinder style. And so when we get to the most important concepts of what this camera is, we kind of get down to this collection of words. And if I had to narrow it even further, I would probably call this a compact medium format fixed lens camera. So if you're trying to describe the camera to a relative or a friend, well, those are the terms that I would use as far as the most briefest of terms. You could also just say it's a really high-end camera. That would work as well. But we're talking about what type of camera this is, so it is a compact medium format fixed lens camera. Now, light travels through the lens, and this time around, I'm actually able to show you the profile of the lens in the actual number of elements in the optical formula that it is actually in this particular camera. This is something that they published with some of their information in there. You get to see all the different lenses they have, how big they are, and how close they are to the sensor. They're able to do things with this particular lens that they cannot do with their interchangeable lens G-mount system, because of how close these lens elements are getting to the image sensor. Now, this is a very special lens, partially because of what's also built into it. And that is, there is a leaf shutter design, which is controlling the light coming into the sensor in here. And so this has got some interesting attributes. There's a couple of things that are really nice about it. One of the things that I think is great is it's really small and lightweight, and therefore very quiet. And so this camera does not make much noise when you press down on the shutter release. Now, when the leaf shutter works, the way it normally is supposed to work is it's normally closed. Now in this camera, because it's a digital camera, it's normally open. And then when you take a picture, it needs to close and then open That's your shutter speed right there. That's letting the light into the sensor, and then it closes. Then it needs to open again so that you can see and compose your next shot. And this is a very different system than what is in most cameras on the market today. Because this leaf shutter is built into the lens system itself, one of the big advantages is that you can use flash at all shutter speeds. And so if you want to use flash at 1,000th of a second, that's not a problem. Because of where it is in the optical path, you can let light through essentially any time with the flash, and it will record it on the sensor. There are limitations to this, and we'll talk about this more in the exposure section. But for now, this is the basics that are correct. Most cameras on the market, most other Fuji cameras, the X mount, the G mount series, they use a focal plane shutter, which means the shutter is at the focal plane where the sensor is in the camera. Now, this starts with the shutter units open so that you can get light into the sensor so that you can see and compose your image. And then when it's time to take a photo, you're going to press down on the shutter release and it closes the shutter. And then it opens, and this is the exposure that you're recording, and then it needs to end the exposure, and then it needs to open again so that you can see your next shot. And because this is right next to the sensor, it's only going to be able to record flash, which happens in a burst, when the shutter blades are completely open, so the sensor is completely visible. So there is a limited time span in which you can use flash on that. Now, with faster shutter speeds, the way that they achieve faster shutter speeds with a focal plane shutter is they use a scanning system where they have each pixel exposed for the same amount of time, but not necessarily at the same time. And that's going to limit your flash usage. You can't use it during those fast shutter speeds. And so that's one of the unique things about the leaf shutter system that is built into this particular camera. Now, the aperture unit is built right behind the leaf shutter on this particular camera. It looks kind of similar to the untrained eye. It's small metal leaves. They close. They don't completely shut off all the light, but they can vary the amount of light coming in to the sensor. And so this is one of the ways of controlling light, obviously, coming into the sensor. And they will close down when you shoot. Now, once light gets to the image sensor, in a normal standby mode, light's going to be recorded by the sensor. It's going to be sent back electronically to the LCD monitor on the back of the camera. It's also sent to the electronic viewfinder that you can see through the viewfinder itself of the camera. And so that is how you're going to be composing with the camera. So those are kind of the vital components in this particular type of camera. Let's talk a little bit about the lens on this camera. So this is a built-in 35mm f4 lens. This is going to give you an angle of view, at least horizontally, of about 64 degrees, which is roughly the equivalent of a 28mm lens on a full frame camera, which puts it right into pretty much the middle of the wide angle world. It's kind of in the slightly wide to a little bit more wide world. And so it's good. It's a good wide angle lens. I think this is a great travel camera, documentary camera, environmental portraits where you're taking a picture of a person in the environment in which they are living, working, or whatever it is that they're doing there. We do have a close-up capability, not especially close, but pretty close at about 20 centimeters or 8 inches. And so it's not great for macro photography, but you can get pretty close to it. So this is a nice general purpose lens on here. It's not something I'm going to be doing sports photography or wildlife work unless you have really good access and it's happening right in front of you. Now, this is the equivalent, because everyone likes to, the equivalent to full frame, as far as an aperture value of 3.2. Now, it's an f4 when it comes to letting light in and what aperture and shutter speed you need, but in accordance to depth of field, then it's going to be the equivalent of an f3.2 lens on full frame when it comes to how shallow of depth of field you're going to get. Generally, this is not the right camera for people who want to get shallow depth of field. With the wide angle lens, the f4 aperture on this, most things are going to be in focus. And that's just the nature of the lens that is on this camera. There's some of the specifications of what is on this particular lens. It is a very high quality lens. Fuji really is one of the best lens makers out there. It does have top quality coatings on here. It's got aspherical elements, which are very high-end, expensive elements to make. in order to get the best quality lens they can in a very small package. Going back to the topic of the image sensor, as I said before, one of the most popular types of film or sensor size area is the full frame format that comes from 35mm film. So this is a very popular system out on the market today. Lots of cameras and lenses use it. Some of the more affordable ones out there use the APS-C system, like the Fuji X system, like the Fuji X100 series of cameras. There's also a lot of other cameras with slightly smaller size sensors. And so smaller size sensors means you can put them into smaller size cameras and other products. And so there's lots of those in the world out there today. But being in the medium format range, this is unique and it is a little bit different. There's not a lot of cameras that do this. It allows you for more pixels, recording more light, and giving you better image quality in general. Now, comparing this with what's mostly going on in the photographic industry, full frame and APS-C sensors, those are 3:2 aspect ratios. And this, as I've mentioned before, and we'll mention again, is a 4:3 aspect ratio, which means it's a little bit more boxy. It's not quite as long. And to a new photographer, this might seem like, well, that's a pretty minor difference. But if you've been shooting with one for quite a while, this gets to make a pretty big difference in some ways. Now, when we're looking at the lens in relationship to the sensor on this particular camera, the 35mm lens in this particular aspect ratio equates to a 27.6mm lens if you're measuring things diagonally, which is pretty close to the 28 that they said. It's like a 28mm lens. It's like a 28.7 when you consider things horizontally. Now, where things are a little bit different is because this is kind of a taller format and not quite as wide. It's more like a 25.5mm lens vertically. So my mind starts rounding that down to 24mm, which is an even wider angle lens. And so it does change the nature of the composition a little bit. And it's one of those things just to be aware of, that when you're getting into this camera, the aspect ratio is a little bit different and the way you compose is slightly different. All right, let's dive into the primary controls on the camera. The on-off, pretty easy to find. The dial on the lens can be used for focusing or controlling other features of the camera. This is something we'll get into later on as we get into customizing the camera. The rear dial on the camera is one of the main dials that you'll be using for adjusting various settings on the camera. Be advised that this is also a push button. Go ahead, give it a try on your camera. You can push in and that can be activated and customized for a variety of controls. The menu also doubles as the OK button. So when you want to confirm a setting, you would press that OK button. The focus lever or stick, joystick sometimes I'll call it, this is going to be used for navigating. And so when you want to go through the menu system, select different items, that's the way to do it. Now you can also do it with the touch screen. And so some people like using the touch screen, some people don't. It's your choice as to whether you use the focus lever or the touch screen on it. Now the camera also has a front command dial that kind of works in conjunction with the rear command dial and a lot of the controls. The difference is that the front command dial, unlike other Fuji cameras, you cannot push in and is not a button on there. Don't know why they took that off. It's just not a feature on this particular camera. All right, shutter release. Like most cameras on the market today, this is a two-stage device. By pressing it halfway down, it does a number of things. Wakes the camera up, activates the metering system, starts the autofocus, but that's optional. You can turn that off if you want to do something called back button focusing. We'll talk about that in section 4 on focusing. And then finally, if you're somewhere in the menu system and you just want to get back to shooting photos, press halfway down on the shutter release and that returns you into the shooting mode on the camera. Then of course you'll press all the way down to activate the shutter release on there. But just be advised that the half press on it does a lot of things on the camera. Now you might notice that there is kind of a hole in the shutter release. It's a threaded cable release adapter there, so you can use an old school mechanical cable release in there. You can also use an electronic one. We'll talk about those later on in the class, but that's why it's got that little cutout in the shutter release. All right, let's talk about something that is very important, that is the file format. Now, as many of you experienced photographers know, we have the basic choice between RAW and JPEG, but it gets much more nuanced when you really get into it here. Now with this camera with RAW, you're going to get the original information off the sensor. There's going to be 14 to 16 bits of information. That's going to give you great detail. Now the JPEGs are very convenient file types to work with. I work with JPEGs all the time. If a friend wants a photo, I send them a JPEG photo because pretty much every photo program in the world works with JPEG images. They're very, very common, and I can send the right size and I can make the adjustments for it. And so the JPEGs work very well on this camera because there's a lot of image style adjustments we're going to talk about here in a moment that you can do on this camera, and Fuji is well known for their in-camera processing for producing really nice looking JPEGs. And so if you want a finished product right in camera, you can do that with a JPEG image. Now the new version of JPEGs, they're not JPEGs, they're something different, but it's kind of like a JPEG in that it's not a raw image, it's a processed image, it's a HEIF file. And so there is an option to go into the image quality setting menu and you can select HEIF over JPEG, and then you'll be getting HEIFs. Now, the issue with HEIFs right now is that it's not super common and not everybody's computer and everybody's computer programs work with HEIF images. So it may not work in your workflow. That's something that you're going to need to test. It is technically better quality than JPEG because it's giving you 10 bits of color rather than 8 bits of color. And so it is better quality at about the same size, but you need to have the workflow to work with it to make it work. So I'm going to continue to talk more about RAW and JPEG in here, but if you want to substitute HEIF, that's up to you. All right, so when you get into the image quality setting, this is where you get to select either RAW or JPEG. So on one level, there's going to be some people who just want the camera to process the images. They're fine with these processed images. There are 3 different versions: normal, fine, and super fine. In all cases, you are shooting 102 megapixels. So you're getting the full resolution from the camera. The difference between these is the compression levels. How much is the camera compressing this data down? So if you want the smallest file, that would be normal. If you want the best quality, that's going to be super fine. If you know you only want JPEGs, I would recommend shooting in the super fine so that you get the best quality JPEGs possible. Now, with most cameras that I work with, I recommend that people shoot RAW. This is the original information off the sensor. It is the full resolution without any compression or any work being done by the camera to process the image. This allows you the maximum versatility later on. And even with this camera, I still maintain that RAW is a great file system to shoot with. However, on this particular camera, it's really good at shooting JPEGs, and there are some advantages, especially when you get into the aspect ratio dial on the back of the camera and the digital teleconverter lever on the front of the camera, and some of the options that you have for cropping in. Not something I normally advise on, but on this camera, I'm changing my tune a little bit. And so we do have the option of shooting JPEG and RAW at the same time. So when you press the shutter release once, you're going to get 2 photos. You're going to get a JPEG and a RAW. And this is actually the way that I'm going to recommend many of you. This is the way I'm going to recommend how I'm going to set it up. At least this is how I do it. And I recommend it for most people, is shooting it in JPEG and RAW. Now, whether you use those JPEGs is up to you. There is an advantage to doing this. And when it comes to the aspect ratio, you can shoot with different aspect ratios. When you have it set to JPEG and RAW, you get your RAW image cropped with the aspect that you selected in the camera, but you can unselect it later on. Because the RAW image gives you all of the original information, you can utilize that, and it makes it very, very beneficial for editing later on down the track. And so what am I going to personally do? I'm not recommending it for you. I'm going to set my camera up to do RAW plus normal because I'm not really going to be using the JPEGs. I'm eventually going to be getting rid of them, but I am using them as reference files. If you feel like you might be using them, you might want to go to the fine option or the super fine option. So all of this can be done in the image quality setting, and I want to give you an example of how that works. And so let's go ahead and explore these options on here. So we're going to dive into the menu. We're going to go over to the left tabs, and we're going to go up to image quality, over to the right. And image quality is currently set on fine. which is not really the best option there. If you were going to just shoot JPEG, I would recommend Superfine. We do have the full option of RAW, which I think is a great option for a lot of people. I'm going to set mine at normal RAW because I do want the RAW image for sure, but I also want a JPEG, and I don't need a big JPEG because I want to save space. I don't want to eat up too much space with super high quality JPEGs. If you were going to use that, if you were going to use the JPEGs as well as the RAWs, you might want Superfine. And so it's really hard for me to recommend to everybody exactly what to do. I think there's a lot of good options in here. I think just shooting JPEG, I got to give you a warning right now. You're going to probably want those RAWs at some point down the road. Unless you're doing something very particular and you know what your project is and you feel comfortable just shooting JPEGs, I think you're going to probably want to shoot with a RAW and a JPEG, and this will make a little bit more sense as we make our way through more of this class in here. Now, raw image is not necessarily just a raw image. There's more to raw images than just on or off. There is different compression levels and different bit levels that you can get into. And in this camera basics section, I don't want to go into that right here. We're going to go into that when we go into the image quality menu. We'll look at some examples of file sizes and image quality that you get from those. And so they're all going to get you good image quality, but the file size is going to be different, and that might be helpful or hurtful depending on your exact workflow and how you work with the camera. So there is more to talk about in RAW, and we'll do that as we get later on into this course. All right, an additional topic that I want to talk about is image style. So here on screen, you've got 5 images. They're all from exactly the same point of view. They have the same content in it, but they all look different. They were all taken with the same camera at essentially the same time, but they were all processed differently. What's different about these can be put into 3 basic categories. Tone, think of that as the brightness, how bright the lights are and how bright the darks are, the color aspect to it, and then the texture or sharpness aspect to it. Now, this is something that Fuji has become somewhat famous for because they are really, really good at color science, and they can adjust this in camera to a lot of very interesting styles that a lot of people have come to like. Now, be advised that as we start making these adjustments, these do not apply to RAW files. It's only going to apply to JPEG images. And so if you make a big adjustment with a RAW image, you're always going to be able to go back to that original information. Now, those images that I just showed you there, these are different film simulations from Fuji. You can select these and many other different film simulations, or you can go in and adjust and create your own modifications of these, or you can create something completely different from these if you want. And this is something that a lot of photographers have worked with in the past, and they like recreating the look of particular films. And so Fuji has a long history of making films, and they can graph where all of their films fit on a scale that measures saturation and contrast. Now, Fuji did something strange here. See if you notice what is a little bit strange. Not everything is on the graph. And considering the graph has no numbers or indications about levels, why some things are placed outside the chart, I don't know. They're just really extreme on those particular categories, I guess. And so these are different film simulations that you can shoot with on this camera. Now, I can show you some examples here. If I show you all of them, they just very small on screen. I know this is probably not going to be the best way to show you what all these film simulations are. And I really think this is something that you need to shoot on your own, do some test examples, whether it's in the studio or out in the field, set the camera up and shoot the same subject with different film simulations to see which ones you might like. Now, I like to shoot pretty kind of standard basic stuff, so I leave it on the Provia standard option for most of my shooting. I'm fine with it there. There is a whole cult following with Velvia or Classic Chrome or Reala Ace and all these other different ones. Different people have different favorite films, and that's all part of the fun of working with Fuji cameras. I, however, do really like the black and white options, the monochrome or acros options that you can have on this. There are different versions of black and white on there. different. So I think there's a little something in there for everyone. Now, if you want to affect the tone of this particular camera, you can go into the tone curve and you can adjust the highlights and shadows. This is like working with a contrast slider, but you have a bit more control because you can work individually with where the shadows are and the highlights are. And so you can increase the shadow brightness, or you can decrease the highlights to get a more decreased contrast, or you can add a bit more of an S curve with darker shadows and brighter highlights to get a little bit more contrast to your image. And you can control these on some very fine levels. And this is a good way of controlling, once again, your JPEG images, not your RAW images, exactly how much contrast you want on a particular image. With a black and white image, as I like to shoot, I often add a bit of contrast with the tone settings here. I'll have different settings set up where I might add 1 or 2 or 3 numbers in the shadows as well as the highlights to get a more contrasty image. Another way to work with tone is a feature called dynamic range. And this is where the camera automatically underexposes the image, and then it will increase the brightness so long as it's not overexposing an area of great brightness. And so it's kind of letting the camera control where the highlights and shadows are a little bit more on its own. Now you can also choose something called D-range priority, which is the same thing as dynamic range, but you allow the camera even more control to adjust the brightness levels from shot to shot. In the dynamic range option, you're telling it to always do this 1 or 2 stops of pushing it, you might say, whereas in the D-range priority, it can adjust and fluctuate from shot to shot in there. All right, let's talk a little bit about color. So one option you have is basically the intensity or saturation of the color. You can increase it, which you might want to do, say, in a landscape image, or you can decrease it, maybe in a portrait image where you don't want the colors to be too saturated. If you're shooting black and white or monochromatic images, you can add just a hint of color to your images as well, choosing the scale there to have a little bit more color to the blue side or to the warm side if you want. So color, once again, is essentially the intensity of that color or the saturation. With monochromatic color, you can add an overall feel. Do you want a cool feel or a warm feel to your black and white images? We also have something called color chrome effect. And the chrome refers to a slide film, which was often very contrasty and had very punchy colors with a lot of saturation. So you could add saturation to primary colors. We also have a color chrome effects for blue that specifically targets the blue channel. This might be good for a landscape scene or any image that has a lot of blue sky in it. If you want that blue to be really vibrant in the image, you could turn that on. When it comes to texture, we can start working with sharpness. Now, everybody wants sharp images, generally speaking, but if you start adding too much sharpness to your JPEG images, it can look over-processed and not look natural on there. And so if you want to adjust upwards or downwards, you can do that. We also have a clarity slider that we can work with, and this is working with sharpness more towards the midtones. It's a little bit more subtle than the blunt hammer of sharpness. And this is something that you can go in and control on your JPEGs as well. Now, Fuji has a long history of working with films that have grain, and so they have simulated grain that you can work with here. And this is very much a personal like or dislike here. Some people like it and some people don't like it at all, but it's something that you can turn on and off and control in various different degrees. Smooth skin effect is another way of dealing with texture, but specifically targeted to skin tones. And so what this will generally do is it'll basically take away a few of the wrinkles and roughness and harshness of the skin and just give skin a little bit more of a smooth finish to it. And so if you're doing portraits, this might be a nice option when you are working, once again, with JPEG images. And so these are some of the many different ways that you can go in and control the look of your images. I just want to repeat it again because it's very important. It does not affect when you set RAW images. It's only going to affect JPEGs. But I think a lot of people are going to shoot JPEGs. They might shoot RAW plus JPEGs on this camera. And you're going to have a nice JPEG that you can really create and work with in camera, so you don't need to worry about processing it later. Now, one of the great things about this camera is that you can save your favorite settings in here for up to 7 different film tones or image styles in the camera. So in the image quality settings, you can go into Edit, Save, Custom Setting, and you can save a particular setting on the camera. And you can change the name to whatever it is that you like to do with that particular image style. And this is a great way for switching back and forth. It'd be like changing films, but being able to change films automatically very quickly in the camera. Let me show you real quickly how this is done in the camera. All right, so if we go into the menu setting, under the image quality, if we go down to page 3, I'll quickly scroll down to page 3, you can see we can edit and save custom settings in here. And so if we go to the right in here, you can see our 7 different preset options. I'm going to go to preset option number 1, and I would like to create a new one. Okay, and now I can go to the right in here, and if I want to edit and check, and I'd like to edit because I haven't made any changes in here, I can basically essentially get back into the menu system. Let's do something that's quick, easy, and very notable. So I'm going to change my camera to black and white right there. So now it's black and white, and that looks good. And I'm going to come down, and I want to change just one thing real quick here. The tone curve. I like doing this. And so I'm going to increase my highlights by a factor of 2, and I'm going to increase my shadows. Whoops, that's decreasing my shadows. I want to increase my shadows a level of 3, and I'm going to call that OK. And I'm going to go back from there, and I'm going to now edit the custom name of this one. And I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to call this BW, and let's just do number 1 because that's my first one there. And I'm going to come up and I'm going to press the set button. You can type in a fairly long name, and you can go into capitals and lowercase and what have you. And if I wanted to erase this, I could do that. I could copy it if need be. I can go in and check it and make more adjustments if I want to. And I'm going to back up out of there. And there we are. We have black and white number 1. And you'll notice my camera's still in color. I'm going to come back into the menu, and I am now going to select, this is now, option is now available. It was grayed out before. And I can select my black and white setting. And now I have a black and white image. Let's see if I can get the camera to focus there. There we go. And so I have a black and white image. And if I want to get out of this, I can go back into the menu system, and I can have nothing selected. And we're back to color here. And you can do that with all 7 different types. You can create different portrait and landscape settings and create a whole collection of film types that you want to emulate with your JPEG images. All right, back to the topic of RAW and JPEG. RAW is nice because you get maximum resolution, maximum versatility later on down the road. 20, 30, 100 years from now, you'll have the best data possible from this sensor to work with information. Now, that does mean you're going to need to work with it later on. That's going to take a little bit of time. It's going to be a little bit larger file size, but I see that nowadays with the increased sizes of memory cards and hard drives as a minor inconvenience. JPEG images are nice because things are done as soon as you shoot the photo. It's fast and it's simple. However, when you get to working with images later on, you can't take a black and white image and make it color, at least not easily. So there are limitations later on with the JPEG, which opens up the door of shooting RAW and JPEG. Not something I usually recommend unless there's something specific you're doing, but on this camera, I think the specifics are the fact that this camera shoots really good JPEGs, and you can have that raw original image to work with, as well as a finished JPEG that you can use very quickly, or you can use it as a reference guide. And so I think RAW plus JPEG is my most recommended setting on this particular camera. All right, so those are some camera basics that I think are important. If you would like to know more information about general photography, I have a number of classes. Photography Essentials is probably my most no-nonsense class, right to the point about everything that's important in photography: exposure, focus, composition, as well as the workflow in there. And so that's a good class. I also have a Composition Essentials, which might be another class if you're interested in really honing your composition skills. And so those are some further study if you're interested in some of the more basic things in cameras and photography. All right, so that gets us to the end of the camera basics section. After this section is when the real deep dive begins. So take a little break, be ready for the next section. It's going to be a big one. We'll see you there.